We have to go forward differently, and I'm sure we will.
Welcome to Island Influencers, where we share stories of successful business owners, experienced professionals, entrepreneurs and community leaders based or with influence in the Isle of Man. This podcast is brought to you by Thornton Chartered Financial Planners, because great financial planning has the power to change your life. Now here's your host, Chartered Financial Planner Sharon Sutton.
This week's guest on Island Influencers is Paul Craine, currently the data manager at Ballakermeen High School and currently working in his 6th decade of education, but he's on the cusp of retiring for the second time. Paul was born and raised on the Isle of Man, and he left the island to study geography at Liverpool University, where he met his wife and then returned to the island and raised his own family. Paul's incredibly passionate about the population, having written and produced the Isle of Man Population Atlas, published in 2016, with more than 130 imaginative maps and graphs, and he's captured and presented the Isle of Man's population, offering an authoritative commentary on a wide range of population issues. He's keen on international development and climate change, having just had his latest article published in an Isle of Man newspapers, showing that the Isle of Man's carbon footprint progress are the third worst out of 26 European countries. So listen to his ideas on this. Paul last stood for the Keys in 2016, and he was not successful in being elected, but he's not going to stand again. Paul's a Methodist lay preacher, leading over 900 services so far. He's attended 9 consecutive Island Games and shares some fascinating stories of his time growing up and his predictions for the future in this week's conversation, episode 46 of Island Influencers. Welcome, Paul Craine, to Island Influencers as my guest this week. Thanks so much for coming on the programme.
Okay, good morning. Good to be here.
This podcast, we record a couple of weeks in advance. So by the time this goes out, we may or may not still be in lockdown, but we're recording this on Zoom. 6th of April, start of the new tax year. And, and we're still in lockdown currently, but that might change. Who knows? Well, Paul, can you tell me a bit about yourself? Tell me where you've come from and how you ended up here.
Okay, I'm going to be 66 next month, so that's a long story, really. So I'll spare you most of that. Born in the Isle of Man, 1955, and the population of the world was only 2.8 billion, and so on. Brought up in the Isle of Man, lived here, went to university from here.
Yes.
Brought up in Douglas. I went to Douglas High School at Ballakermeen and St Ninians. Yeah. University at Liverpool to read geography, which is a major part of who I am, really. Did 6 straight years at university, which was quite a privilege, really, to do that. A geography degree and then research in the Isle of Man's population, then a teaching year. Yeah. And then taught on Merseyside for 5 years. Married Anne, she's from Liverpool. And then came back to the Isle of Man in 1984 as head of the geography department down at Castle Rushen. Was promoted there to assistant head in the year 2000, moved to the department as the island's senior secondary advisor. Yes. Retired for the first time in 2015. But I stood for the House of Keys for the second time. Didn't get in. Decided
it's a very close election from what I remember. It was very close, wasn't it?
Well, I lost it on the postal votes. I would have been in on the basis of the votes on the day, but not on the postal experience. And I'd always said if I didn't get in the Keys, I'd do something part-time. So quite quickly, I took on a role at Ballakermeen as a data manager, helping develop pupil tracking and so on. Gosh. And I've been doing that since then, and I'm still doing that now, but I finished at the end of next month. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. And you're going to retire again?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Gosh. Oh, congratulations. I bet it's been quite surprising during lockdown how the data processing has become more and more.
Well, the data processing has grown in education anyway. I started teaching in 1979, so I'm now in my 6th decade in education. Okay, which when you put it like that,
yes, it does
horrendous. But done a lot of other things along the way, but even in education, I've been an examiner at GCSE level and a team leader at GCSE level for over half my life, 35 years now. I've been a reviser on one of the boards in England. So I work on the papers before the students sit them. So I've got 2 days this week where I'm working on the 2022 papers.
Yes.
So I have a lot of involvement. I was a trained Ofsted inspector and a trade.
Yes, I read that in your CV. I thought, I wondered if you want to say that.
Yeah. And spent many years training teachers and running the national strategy in the Isle of Man. So had a major contract with an authority in England, bringing people in to lead training for teachers. So I've been very involved in education for a long time. Yes, other things too along the way. So I'm a long-standing Methodist lay preacher.
Yes. How many services have you led?
Over 900 now. Yeah. So I started preaching as an 18-year-old. So it's something I've done for a very long time. My faith is important to me. Got involved in Island Games almost by accident, but I ended up going to 9 consecutive. I remember
you very well from that.
That's right. Yes, remember you did. Yes, that's right. So I went to 9 consecutive Island Games. I've been involved in issues relating to the development of less economically developed countries for a long, long time. So I've travelled looking at schemes in Tanzania and Sierra Leone. The Methodist Church in the Isle of Man is twinned with the Methodist Church in Sierra Leone, so that's something.
I didn't know that. Right.
But we've had a long involvement, 10 years now of that. So I've been out to Sierra Leone and was involved in setting up that twinning.
Yes. You're involved in Churches Alive in Man as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I am, because there's a local World Development Committee, and I represented that committee on the Churches Alive in Man executive. So yes, I'm involved in Churches Alive. So
I'm seeing a big theme in what you've been involved with, right from geography, right, really, and how it's involved in the whole economics of the planet.
And then I'm probably best known just for the population stuff I've done on the Isle of Man.
Very interesting. I had a look at that.
2016, I produced the Isle of Man Population Atlas because way back as a 21-year-old, after my first degree, I did research in the island's population for 2 years.
Right.
So I did a thesis on population policy in a low-tax country, basically looking at the Isle of Man's original policies on population. And that has been an ongoing interest ever since. I love playing with maps, playing with graphs, love data.
Yeah, well, I look forward to exploring those subjects as we go through your podcast, because I'm sure you've got some interesting comments on that. And just to be clear, you're not going to stand again for election, are you?
The politics is behind me, yes. I'm involved now in climate change issues. I did some training in 2019 with the Climate Reality Project.
Yes, I saw that. That was put together by Al Gore, is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, I attended 3 days of training, and they were led for the most part by Al Gore, with many, many other guests too. Some fascinating people. Tom Friedman, who wrote The Earth is Flat, and some various other journalists, politicians, mayors, experts in their fields, university professors and so on. Yes. Yeah, it was good training. Yeah.
If you don't mind, let's move on to the questions I ask all guests. I mean, if you don't mind me asking, and primarily I do ask in my role, my normal day job as a financial planner, what was your earliest memory of money? I mean, I know you said that you were able to spend 6 years away at university. So I'm, just wondering the way you were brought up as a child, and did that have any bearing on how you've sort of developed throughout your life?
Yeah, I guess the way you're brought up inevitably has a bearing on the way you live, really. Earliest memories of money as a child, memories of a sort of money box that I had, but it was a safe, really, with a key and quite a serious lock on it, so only small. But I think if you look back to my early years, the late 50s, early 60s, the Isle of Man had been through a very difficult period, and now I look back on the statistics of it, but the reality at the time was that although my dad was in business, he had a pharmacy, a chemist shop down by the bus station in Douglas. Craine's the chemist. And my uncle was involved in on the managerial side in banking. They were both in their 40s, and yet they shared a car that was 15 years old. And in a sense, that speaks volumes about the economy of the day, So we were comfortable. We weren't short of money. We weren't wealthy. But yes, I went to university. In those days, you got all your fees paid, of course, but it still cost your parents to send you there. When I did research, I had a university studentship, so I had a grant to cover that.
Yeah, but, on the steam packet, you went on the steam packet every weekend home there?
No, occasional weekends. Indeed, in those days, crazy though it seems, so we're talking now 1973, 74, you got 25% discount on the plane, and so it was as cheap to come home by plane. You could come home for a weekend for £5 by plane. So if I was going home, I often would fly home just because it was cheap, but there was no worries then about climate change. And
no,
so on.
No, indeed. Okay. Well, so of all the things you've done throughout your life so far, what things have given you the most fulfillment? I mean, from a personal perspective and from a career perspective and, organizational community perspective?
Oh, that's really hard. Perhaps at the end of my life, I'll be able to give an answer.
Well, so far,
So far, we've got 2 daughters, and they're great. We love them. We so respect them. But they're both in Yorkshire, and they've each got 1 daughter.
Yes.
So we've got 2 granddaughters. We're hugely proud of them.
Quite recently, from what I remember, is they're quite young.
They're 2 and 3 at the moment, but absolutely with the world. Our 3-year-old told us a couple of weeks ago, you can come to our house, because we haven't seen them for nearly a year, really. You can come to our house when Boris says so, but he keeps changing his mind, which is quite an insight into the world we're in. I look back at really fond years of 20 years in teaching, youngsters I met. And the extraordinary thing about teaching in the Isle of Man is that in adulthood, you end up working with people you taught. You end up on committees with people you taught, meeting. And I never expected that at the time that they were in my classroom, But so that it's an extraordinary experience. So teaching Island Games enriched my life, going to games as a geographer, because that's, I was as much interested in the geography of the islands we visited.
What's the most fascinating that you went to? And that's a really good point, actually. What was the best island games venue you ever went to?
Different memories from the sporting point of view. Perhaps it would be different from the geographer's point of view. But I remember the first games I went to was Åland, the Finnish group of islands in the Baltic. And the first day there, I'd wandered out from the games village area and went down to the harbour and saw the most amazing ship coming in. It looked so futuristic, just the style of it and so on, and so different from the steam packet boats of 1991. And I said to somebody, where does the boat go? And they said, it goes between Mariehamn here and Sweden, Stockholm. So I said, how far is that? And they said, it's 4 hours. Now, 4 hours was the standard ferry journey from the Isle of Man to Liverpool. So the next question was inevitable. How much does it cost? And the answer I got, it's £4. This was 1991, so it was well above that, travelling to Liverpool. It was £4 and cars go free.
Right.
And I was absolutely speechless. When I eventually sort of got around it, I said, well, how does that work? And they said, well, the boat is really a floating casino, and very few people get off when it arrives here. It's duty free in the casino because they're not allowed in Sweden. Oh, okay. And suddenly you've got a whole new insight into transport between communities. It's
well, I suppose it's snowy and dark for a large part of the year up there.
Yeah.
Gosh, that's interesting. Did you want to mention anything about the Atlas stuff that you've done or anything like that?
Yes, the Atlas was a labour of love, really. I had come close to producing something in way back based on the 2001 census, but the technology of drawing maps on a home computer was totally wiped out, or my ability was wiped out when a piece of software called Super Paint was withdrawn and didn't run on any of the new Apple Macs and
right.
so on. So
yeah.
And the awareness of being de-skilled at a stroke, So eventually the Atlas came out of using Apple Pages and using Excel for generating graph work and so on. There are a couple of thousand hours of work in that book, So
yeah, sure.
It was a long time putting it together. In a sense, if you'd done a similar book on the UK's population, it probably would have sold in some sort of reasonable quantity, but that was never the aim. It was going to be on the Isle of Man, and many of the copies sold. I sold at just the cost to print it to schools. So there are a few hundred copies in the schools at a cut price, and they've used it there. And I've been asked to speak in a couple of schools on population issues and so on.
Sure. I think you told me once that when you were young, you went to a Scout jamboree in Japan.
I did. Scouts is the other thing we've not mentioned so far, I guess.
Okay.
I was involved in Scouts as a young lad, and yes, as you say, I got asked, was I interested, and I was, and applied and interviewed and so on, and went with another Manx Scout to the Scout Jamboree in 1971, which again shows my age, and that was in Japan. And that was an absolutely extraordinary experience. I'd never travelled outside the British Isles, and suddenly I was going to Japan. And
how did you get there?
Well, we joined other groups of Scouts in London, so the two of us flew down to London and joined them.
Who else did you go with?
I went with Alan Tier. Okay, Alan is a former Scout commissioner in more recent years. Yeah,
right.
But I went with Alan, and we had some time in Tokyo, and indeed we'd only been there 24 hours when we were put into the hands of a local family. Okay, so I was with a family in Yokohama outside Tokyo. So at 16, I was on a train traveling with a complete stranger who was taking me to meet this family. I didn't know who I was meeting. I knew their name, nothing more. I was on a train where I was the only European on the train, and you're looking up and down the train thinking, gosh, this is amazing. And stayed 2 days with a family in Yokohama who were, very hospitable and so on. They were the mother of the family. They had small children, and the mother of the family was teaching English to Japanese school children, not as part of their school. Well, this is why they'd volunteered to take British Scouts, So sure. It was an after-school club that she had. So I had to help her with a session with these young children who came round, 7, 8, 9-year-olds who came round to her house. But I'm still in touch with her. I met up with her in the Lake District about 10 years ago. And I got a calendar from her just at the start of the year, so
how lovely.
Yeah, it's amazing. She's in her 70s now, but it's so quite something. And then we camped with 20,000 Scouts at on the foothills of Mount Fuji. And we got hit by a typhoon. That jamboree is famous for being hit by this typhoon. So we had a meter of rain in 24 hours, which was absolutely extraordinary. And most of the campsite was evacuated, but we camped through it. So we camped through this experience. And it was because of that I then got to meet the Crown Prince of Japan, who later became Emperor Akihito. So this was Hirohito's son, which is remarkable. And it's my claim to fame is that the scout who was next to me was from Liverpool. So he had a conversation with him. Where are you from? He said he's from Liverpool. So he said to me, are you from Liverpool as well? So I said, no, I'm from the Isle of Man, and explained where the Isle of Man was. So I've known for all these years. I've known for all these years that the Emperor of Japan knows where the Isle of Man is. But he stood down last year, and his son has taken over. So
right, okay.
And I also met there Neil Armstrong. 1971 was just 2 years after the moon landing, and he was at the Jamboree. So
that's phenomenal.
Extraordinary, yeah.
Yeah, isn't it just?
Yeah,
so how was it for you then I think you've said before, it was a life-changing experience. I mean, is it in respect of the people that you met, or was it something else?
I went at the end of what's now year 11, at the end of what's now GCSE years.
Yeah.
I went in that summer holiday, and it had been my plan to do history at university. That was the plan. I was going to go into sixth form, doing history, geography, and English. I was going to do history at university. That's what was in my head. And I came back with a different view of the world, really. And I kind of, the geographer was born, if you like, camping on the foothills of Mount Fuji with 20,000 scouts from 105 nations, being invited
in a typhoon,
and a typhoon, and a time with a Japanese family and international travel. We'd stopped off at Alaska on the way out. And on the way back, again, we went to Alaska. So we're crossing the time zone. And just the thought that if you'd said to me where I was at such and such a time on a Sunday afternoon, I was in Japan and I was in Alaska because we'd crossed the time zone and so on. So it was
goodness me.
An extraordinary experience. So, yes, life-changing in many ways.
Yeah, remarkable. As you said, totally inspiring, really. For any aspiring or existing business owners or entrepreneurs or community leaders, what would be your number one tip? I suppose you can think of it from what we've just been through, which has in itself been remarkable from the last year or so that we've had of dealing with COVID. What would be your number one tip, business tip?
It would perhaps be presumptuous for me to offer tips for business when my life has been in education. I could offer advice for people in education that may be transferable.
Indeed.
In terms of making lessons that work, being prepared is over and above everything. Don't rely on personality. Don't rely on any of the other sort of knowledge and tricks and be prepared. Being thoroughly prepared to engage young people in learning was critical. In terms of my bigger view of the world, my tip, perhaps for those who haven't yet recognized that the world is changing as climate change comes and other factors too changing, these are things they need to focus on because these really are going to change the world we live in, hopefully for the better. But there's change coming. We have, for too long, relied on the natural environment around us to deal with our waste, our pollution, and everything else. And that has got to stop. If you add together the plastics issues, the extinctions issues, the declining biodiversity issues, as well as all the factors relating to climate change, the way it's changing the oceans and the atmosphere and the way it's adding to forest fires and increased storms and more intense rainfalls, droughts and floods and everything else. This is changing. And
so what are the best things about living in the Isle of Man, though, from that perspective? Because we're a biosphere, right?
Well, everywhere's a biosphere, in the sense that we're a UNESCO biosphere reserve, aren't we? Yeah. So I think that's great. And in many ways, the Isle of Man is environmentally really remarkable. You look at the community that we have here, the quality of our landscapes, the hills, the seas, and so on. And there are many, many things here that are good. But you can't rest on your laurels in the current position where the Isle of Man Climate Change Bill is currently going through the branches of Tynwald. But our starting point is not a good position to be in. We're producing 870,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And the output, then, our emissions per head of population at 10.4 tons per head, our measured emissions, would make us the worst in the British Isles, and would make us worse than 25 out of the 27 European Union countries. So
yeah, I saw that because you sent a report, didn't you, to the newspaper, which was in the Independent last week. I saw that, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
And I saw the graph, the CO2 emissions in the EU 27. Yeah. And we're very poor.
we're not in a good starting point, and where that gets, and indeed we've been making no progress either. Whereas the United Kingdom has now cut its emissions by 51% since 1990, and our emissions have risen by 60% over the same period.
Yeah, I saw that graph.
Yeah, okay, and it's shocking, really, in terms of where we're at, but okay, we've got to recognise that, we've got to own that. We can see, when you cross the Irish Sea and you go through those swathes of turbines, wind turbines, and you see the renewable energy transition that's been taking place for over 30 years now, as the gas rigs have given way to the wind turbines. None of those are ours, of course.
No.
We're still on gas and diesel and a tiny bit of hydroelectric and the energy from waste plant. But fundamentally here, the way we generate electricity is not good. We really haven't got much movement into electric cars. And part of the reason for that is that if you're going to run an electric car and you plug it in, and that's great, and you've got regenerative braking and so on. I use an electric car, but I'm fully aware that when I plug it in to recharge it, it's a gas-fired power station that's recharging it. In the UK, you'd be getting renewable energy.
Yeah. So what solutions can you see for that? I mean, we've got a roof full of solar panels here. But,
okay, great. But
I don't suppose everybody can do that, can they? And
it would be good to see movement in that direction. But again, there's not a great deal of incentive. You haven't been able to sell any surplus electricity. You get back to the
we don't do too badly, actually.
Bank's utility.
They just put the price down. They give you back, which to me makes no sense. If they want to encourage people, they put the price up, surely. But hey,
well, I think the way we've got to go, if we are going to have, and there was a report by Professor James Curran going back 2019, and he mapped out the way that we need to get to move to, when the climate bill goes through, it will commit us to being net carbon zero by 2050. And the route to that, we've got 70,000 vehicles on the Isle of Man. So the notion that we need 20,000 of those to be electric by 2030, and that's just picking off the first 20 out of the 70,000. It's only one step on the way there, as it were. In order to achieve that, we need to have incentives. We need to have the issue of charging near to people's homes. We need to have that. Moving forward, with some good thinking on it, the rate of adoption of electric vehicles in the UK per head of population is much, much higher than here, and the same with heating, whether using solar or whether using ground source heat pumps and so on. The incentives to move in that direction. Professor Cohen had talked about all of the houses on the island that are using oil-fired heating. He thought they should be phased out by 2030. We're getting nearer and nearer to that date as the years pass, but we really haven't started on it. And so we're still in this position where our electricity generation and our transport and our heating, these are all fossil fuel based. And that has got to change to get down to zero by 2050.
You mentioned about housing. So it seems that, you see a lot of new houses being built. They still insist on using lots of bricks as opposed to timber frame structures, which are better for heat source pumps, or am I wrong on that?
And well, the heat source is quite different from the construction techniques. So the heat sources are something else. But the way buildings are built, yes, it's true. The climate change bill going through Tynwald has a clause in it that will make it will ban effectively houses being built from January 2025, which isn't so far away. It'll ban houses being built with fossil fuel heating.
Right.
So if you're going to require houses not to have gas, not to have oil and so on, if you're going to require them to be using something that's greener than that, we've only got less than 4 years to be having renewable sources of energy, because there's no point requiring people to pay more for a house that's heated with a heat source pump, and it is at the moment more expensive. Prices will fall as it becomes the main method of heating. But if you're requiring people to do that, you can't then require them to buy their electricity from gas and diesel power stations. So this transition into generation of renewable energy, that has to come. Indeed, the hard bits come at the end of that, when we've got to look at the storage of electricity and how that's going to work. And there are many methods emerging for that, but we need to be started on this path, because it's not that long before we'll get there.
No, so housing is quite soon. Cars just by the end of 2030, when they've already said that most vehicle manufacturers are going to phase out new manufacturers.
Right. In the UK, they're stopping new cars from then. Globally, that the dates that countries have set have tended to be coming down.
Yeah.
And you only need to look at the television advertising, and you can see very clearly how new car adverts, and nearly all the major models now are coming out with electric versions, and we can see that transition happening in front of us, really.
Yes.
But we will need to do that, and perhaps to use the car less, use public transport more. Yeah. But again, public transport, clean, green public transport, and so we've got a lot to do. But
and the power station, I mean, that's a massive challenge. What's this power station's due expiration date? Has it got one?
I think there's a date by which it's fully paid for, and that's a date that's been some people have used. But I don't think in the short term, I don't think we're looking to phase out and replace. We're looking to develop the renewables alongside it. We're going to have to, in the intervening period, we're going to have a network that works, really, that's not just dependent on renewables from probably mainly wind, which the Isle of Man has a great wind regime, but also solar power, photovoltaics, and so on. We will need to have that supplemented until we've got such a robust network that we can cope with days when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. And that is distinctly possible. Around the world, the ability to run power stations. I used to take students from Castle Rushen down to see the pumped hydro plant in Wales, where it's a power station that uses more electricity than it generates, which is a little bit strange, but it uses electricity, cheap electricity, to pump water up to a huge reservoir at the top of the hill. And then when it's required at peak times, they let it come down. It's a hydro power station. And that's a way of storing electricity, on days when the wind is blowing, you pump water uphill, and you've got that potential energy there to run at a later stage. Yeah. But we have to tackle these things. The carbon dioxide issue, which most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has only been put there since 1970. So this is our problem. We've caused it.
So what would you do? Say, all right, you put the clock back. What would you do if you were in a position to make change? What would you do?
I think unless you've been through the experience that we're all now going through, you possibly would have made the same erroneous decisions that this isn't a problem, And when you read the history of it and the way some of the oil companies were initially had growing awareness of what was going on, that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere doesn't really disappear. It tends to get removed from the atmosphere as trees use it up, really. Yes. But the carbon dioxide we're putting in the atmosphere this year, most of it will still be there in 1,000 years' time, and 20% of it will still be there in 10,000 years' time. And that's an extraordinary thing to think about, that never mind your grandchildren and your grandchildren's grandchildren, this is 40 generations, and they're still being impacted by this. So we have to reduce the carbon. In terms of the Isle of Man's ability to come back on this, we're small and fleet of foot, and we can do things faster than other places can do them if we put our mind to it. But the will has to be there, and the commitment has to be there. Having stood for election in 2016 and had a number of conversations on the doorstep. It was interesting to see that the people who were most vociferous about the issue were just desperate not to see wind turbines on the Isle of Man. So we've still got to deal with all of that. But in terms of the damage to the planet, the Isle of Man has already taking steps in mitigation. So we're seeing these harbour walls being built everywhere because of the fears over rising sea levels and those sort of changes taking place. But we need to legislate in so many different ways. We need to make sure that houses being constructed are passive houses that require very little heating and well insulated. We need to make sure that the energy sources for the houses are as green as we can make them in terms of transport and farming, changes in farming coming too. There's hardly any area of life. It's the way we generate electricity. It's the way we make things. It's the way we build buildings. Even making concrete produces carbon emissions. So it's the way we build, it's the way we travel, it's the way we grow things, it's the way we work. There's an enormous transformation coming. And that's where I think businesses need to see this coming.
Absolutely.
Other changes too, which just you asked about tips for business. The Isle of Man has this population issue. We've got an older population and younger people were leaving, especially between 2011, 2016. We're waiting for the new census, which I'm someone who gets excited about censuses.
Yes, I read that, yeah.
But what we've got going on, we've seen the births in the Isle of Man fall, okay? So we've had a fall here from 1,020 births in 2010 to now we're under 700 births a year. So it's been 10 consecutive years of fall. And that's not all just an Isle of Man problem. The male sperm count, which sounds like a bit of a deviation, the male sperm count is down 50% in 40 years globally.
Gosh.
Globally, okay. And births are falling. There's now the fear that the population of the planet was going to grow on growing till the end of the century. The latest suggestions are that by 2064, we'll cease to have global population growth. We will then have slow decline. Fertility is falling because of the changing role of women and women choosing to work and choosing to limit family size. But the sperm count is falling because of some of the chemicals in the petrochemical industry. And these things added together, what I'm reading at the moment is books talking about the slowing down of the world. We're going to see a slowdown in population, a slowdown in economic growth, a slowdown in innovation. We've a different time coming. According to many of the people who are trying to look at this and look ahead. And the challenges are there for the future, and changes too in the way we live. Perhaps in order to consume less, we will have different lifestyles, that as we go forward. Population at 8 billion at the moment, some figures are saying it won't go much beyond 9 billion, 9.5 billion. We'll see the limit, and then population growth will not be the issue that we thought it was. So
that's
change is
fascinating.
coming.
Yeah, that's totally fascinating. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, and not a little bit kind of surprising, really. I wouldn't have expected you to say that, but. Yeah. Okay. So what sort of solutions and opportunities could you see, ahead for us, really? You mentioned population decline. How about, can you see families moving back here at any point?
Well, it's interesting, waiting to see really the impact of the pandemic. We're certainly hugely aware of families moving out of London, people relocating as a result of the pandemic experience, and this notion of working from home. Where's that going to take us in terms of, will it bring people here who can still work away when they live somewhere more attractive, or will it mean people who actually are not living here but are working here remotely? I don't know. There'll be changes there. I think our hope lies in the younger generations, I'm a huge fan of Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish girl who,
yes,
she gets criticised for being naive, but she absolutely speaks truth to power. And I've read the book that she's produced, and it's full of common sense and
Donald
wisdom.
Trump didn't like her, did he?
No, he didn't. He didn't. I think the feeling was mutual, perhaps, from the glare she gave him at one conference, I remember.
Yes. Yeah,
but the young people in the Isle of Man have been quick to pick up on the theme. We've had some of the protests outside Timber buildings. I think they've had about 10 of those protest sessions now, and they perhaps were very influential in the original decision that the Isle of Man would have a climate change bill. So they've helped to change the reality. And I think, young people are seeing these issues, are growing up with these issues, very much part of the world they're going to inherit. So I think there's great hope there. I have great hope that expectation that we will get through this phase. You're looking back over the last 200 years, it's been an enormous shame that we've followed bad technology, really. We've followed the technology of taking the fossil fuels out of the ground and burning and restoring the carbon that had been sequestered in them, going back into the atmosphere over just a couple of generations. And that is an enormous shame. Although I recognize that in many ways, the wealth of the world that we have today and the standards of living we have been on the back of that. We've all benefited from that. We've all grown through that. But we have to go forward differently, and I'm sure we will.
Yeah,
but
we need to align our values and value.
Absolutely. Yeah. Indeed, the fascinating report last month, the Dasgupta report, saying that national economics, gross national products, gross domestic products, and so on, should all be measured differently to take account of the sustainability. In other words, the damage done to the environment. You can't just measure how strong the economy is by the money it's churning out if it's doing that on the back of damage to the environment.
Yeah.
That's absolutely valid.
Did you hear Mark Carney's the Reef lectures he did?
Yeah, I have seen Mark Carney's work. Yes, he's become quite a global ambassador, isn't he? I think
he has.
UNESCO at the moment. And,
he made the point that the Amazon company, it appears on one of the largest companies globally.
Yeah.
And yet the Amazon itself isn't listed on any balance sheet anywhere.
No, that's right.
It's more valuable. So, Paul, it's exciting all the things that you've been doing, but what have you got planned next? Because I know you're going to stop at Ballakermeen, but you're going to keep busy, aren't you?
Yeah, I certainly am. Yes. I plan to keep my hand in the bits that I do for exam boards in the UK.
Right.
But there's a census at the end of May, and at some stage there'll be a census report coming out. And I'd like to have another go at a population atlas to take that forward and update that. The last atlas came out just before we had it confirmed that the population had stopped growing and had indeed fallen. There was a lot of skepticism about that at the time, but the evidence was there that we weren't growing anymore. Now we've got some evidence that perhaps there's been some population growth, but it does appear that the working age group population is flatlining, and the growth is in over 65. So we are currently up in the top 6 countries in the world for the percentage of the population aged 65 and over. So we're at quite an extreme position in population. And with the births falling, this is a real issue, that there is, in a world where population growth slows down, there will be competition for workers and for young people. We should not take them for granted. In Japan already, you can go and do degrees there without having to pay fees because they're quite keen for you to go and live there, So we've got countries around the world looking to attract young people in. And indeed, the UK is doing that in its own way.
Yes.
We are not offering a great deal in the Isle of Man. There are jobs, there are real jobs, that's true, and some of them have real prospects, but we are not competing clearly successfully in terms of getting young people to stay here or move into here when we see the numbers dropping the way that they did between 2011 2016. So competing for young people is going to be part of the the future problems too. And there's also, in terms of other things, I'm looking at. In terms of climate change, I did this course with Al Gore, a 3 days training. I taught climate change at A level when I was back in teaching, and had followed closely ever since. But the opportunity to get involved in the Climate Reality Project fell in my lap, really. We'd booked a holiday to go and visit good friends in Minneapolis, and there was a training course running while we were there. So I applied and was accepted. But the Climate Reality Project now has between 30 and 40,000 leaders globally who've committed to taking the training, getting access to the resources, and to running sessions locally for any group that's interested. So offer a presentation on climate change from, you give me the direction you want. If you're wanting the international picture, what is it? Why is it happening? How can we solve it? Happy with that. If you want it from an Isle of Man perspective, looking at the changes in our own climate, which it's measurable, you can see here, even though we've only had a Met Office since 1948, you can see the changes in our temperatures, and looking here at where we're going in terms of the solution to it. So I'm happy to offer that.
That's wonderful. Great.
I've done training for the Positive Action Group for Manx Wildlife Trust. Last month, Microgaming asked me in to do a session for them. So I'm happy to do this free of charge. Indeed, I'm committed to doing it with a contract with Climate Reality. I'm committed to doing it without charging, using their resources for businesses, for small groups. If you can get 10 people together, I'm happy to come and do a presentation.
We'll do that. That sounds great. Yep. Well, as soon as we're allowed to at St. John's Mill, we'll organise one. That sounds
okay. Very good
idea, Paul. Thank you. I always ask guests, are there any books that you've read recently that you'd recommend to our listeners as a source of inspiration? What sort of things would you?
Okay. I would recommend Factfulness by Hans Rosling.
Okay.
Hans Rosling is a Swedish doctor he died last year, but he did some fantastic presentations on TED Talks and things like that.
Oh, okay.
On population and economic change. Terrific graphics, really superb stuff. I love those.
Would you be able to send me a link to that?
Yes, I can do.
If you drop me a link to it, I'll put it in the show notes.
There's a quote in there that's one of my absolute favourite quotes, which is it's got a section headed "The Mega Misconception that the world is getting worse."
Yes.
It's a misconception. And he shows a whole series of graphs of things that are getting better, that's desirable, and things getting less. So reduced hunger, reduced malnutrition, more women with votes, and, so many ways in which the world is changing for the better. So that's a good book. Danny Dorling's book, just called Slow Down. Danny Dorling is Professor of Geography at Oxford, and his book Slow Down is really powerful. It's good stuff. But the book that I've got on the go at the moment, Christian Aid have produced a new book called Rage and Hope. So it's a book of prayers, and they're really fabulous prayers. They're prayers for a better world, really. And,
great. Okay. Well, if you'd stick those in a note, I'll put them in the show notes so our listeners can have a look at them.
Do.
Yes, that's good. So is that your favourite quote then?
And yes, it probably would be that, and the really simple quote from Greta Thunberg. My name is Greta Thunberg. I'm 15 and from Sweden, and that's such an innocuous starting point for somebody who then goes on to challenge the world leaders at Davos and at the UN and the European Union and the House of Commons and so on. It's a reminder of what can be achieved, even by somebody who doesn't have the experience, doesn't have the full extent of an education yet. Is still well. She was 15 in 2018. She's still just barely becoming an adult, really. But it's a massive starting point. I've got such respect for her.
No, indeed, yes, me too. So where can people go to learn more about you and the work that you're doing? I give the Population Atlas. So we've got the IOM Population Atlas.paulcraine.im.
Yes, I've got a website for the Atlas stuff. The Atlas is out of print now. Yeah. There's a sense in which no matter how fast you produce it, the next census is coming along every 5 years. So you do all the analysis. The report from the census doesn't come out until, well, last time it was a year after the census before we got the report. So by the time you've then written up anything, it's time for the next census. So yeah, they could look to there. They can access me. Craine@manx.net is my email. If they're interested in a climate reality presentation.
Yep, and you're on Facebook as well, aren't you? And LinkedIn, I think?
I am on Facebook, yeah. I'm on LinkedIn too, but I hardly have time to use those, in all honesty.
Absolutely. I can see you've got an awful lot on there. No, that's great. Yeah, okay. Well, I'll make sure that I put the links to all those in your
thank you.
In the resources for the podcast, so that listeners can go find out more about you. And as for the information that was in the newspaper last week,
the bill going through.
Yeah, is that anywhere that document?
It probably isn't anywhere. If somebody hasn't read it, I've got a photograph of the page, as it were, that I could send a copy if they contacted me.
I mean, that's a really inspiring and informative podcast. I'm, really grateful to you for agreeing to record with me today, Paul. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Island Influencers from Thornton Chartered Financial Planners. To find out more and for useful links, visit thorntonfs.com/podcasts.